Greetings and thank you for watching. Today I'm going to restart my Handbaskets to Hell book reviews. I used to do them all the time in NLQ. No longer quivering, I'm going to be doing them here. And I'm going to be doing some really deep dives into books written by or written about the experience of non-denominational evangelical faith and some of the side rambles. Today's is by Debi Pearl. It is a book called Create a Better Brain Through Neuroplasticity. It's all about the brain. Brains. If you don't know who I am, I'm Suzanne Tinkemeyer. I used to write for Pathos, a column called No Longer Quivering, every single day, 4 or 5 times, as much as 4 or 5 times a day, but at least once a day. And I covered all things in that particular world, in the evangelical, quiverful world, the non-denominational, high-demand taco church world. That was my jam. That is still my obsession. I was a member of one of those churches for many, many years, and I finally left when I started having such bad cognitive dissonance. I had to leave. I had to leave because it was obvious that what they were saying and they were doing were two different things. And they were impacting my mental health and the health of my entire family, mental and physical. Debi and Michael Pearl, okay, they churn out a lot of books between the two of them at their ministry. No Greater Joy, No Greater Joy Ministry, No Greater Joy magazine they publish 4 times a year. The whole shtick for them, a lot of it boils down to submission of women, beating of children. That's the simplistic way. Michael started this whole nasty ball rolling by writing a book called To Train Up a Child. Now, the first time I ever encountered To Train Up a Child was when my youngest was 4. And we had just joined our quiverful church. And she had a bout of a disease called ITP, a medical condition. Basically, your platelets die off for no known reason, and she at 4 was very clingy to me, and I was very clingy to her. We were kind of like buddies in a foxhole because we had been through so much with her illness, hospitalizations, frequent medical tests, and all sorts of things. So I joined that church then in the middle of that, and someone gave me a copy of To Train Up a Child in the first month because they said my daughter was way too clingy. Child has been through terrible medical experience. Clingy? I think it's pretty normal. So I thanked the person. I read a couple of chapters of the book and I was like, oh, hell no. You can't beat a child with low platelets. And I threw it away. And didn't think anything more of it, even though I kept crossing paths with those at our old church that promoted the Pearls. So that was my first experience with the Pearls and their particularly crooked theology. And even while I was there and I was a fully sold out quiverful mama in many ways, I could not embrace the Pearls and their advice to beat your child with a plumbing line, the plastic plumbing line, with a wooden spoon, with a plastic dowel, a glue stick, whatever you had at hand, apparently, for every reason. You think your child's thinking the wrong thing? Beat them. There's a story in his book, To Train Up a Child, where he talks about a little boy who was a toddler who was very rebellious to his parents. The parents came to see the Pearls. And Michael got in that car and drove that poor screaming kid around after midnight. And every 5 miles or so stopped to switch the kid. That's not how you get toddlers to not cry. It's not it at all. And you set some people up for some really bad things if you proceed this way. You set them up for all sorts of things, but that's a discussion for another day. This is all about Debi's book. Let me say, these are my opinions. These are what I came up with based upon my reading of the book. Please don't send anybody any hate as a result of this, not even Debi. Even though I do have vision sometimes of them falling into the hands of the vengeful God they follow and him whipping out a giant glue stick and disciplining them. But that's just my dumb fantasy. So Debbie started writing this book after Michael had a stroke. They've tried to downplay that stroke a bunch of times and say it did not affect him much at all. He didn't have much in the way of cognitive difficulties, but he did disappear from the ministry pretty much for a couple of years at least, maybe even longer. He had, I'm sure he had lasting damage. A lot of us have that. And this is something I know about because I've had 3 strokes. I had a thalamic stroke in utero that was only recently discovered. I had a TIA, one of those teeny tiny little mini strokes, and I had a more major thalamic stroke, which I'm still dealing with the side effects now. And I've gotten a ton of physical therapy, occupational therapy, those sort of things. I don't know if Michael Pearl ever got any of that. But then again, they did spend a whopping huge amount of money to get him stem cell treatments, unproven stem cell treatments. I'm sure this book comes out of Debbie's research and trying to figure out what to do. There's just 2 big problems with this book that you're going to see repeated again and again and again and again as we do the review. Number 1, Debbie's definitions of words are not quite right many times. And not just her definitions are wrong, but she looks at the scientific research on these different brain things. It comes to a totally different and not entirely true understanding about what this actually means. So the whole book is predicated on this ridiculous stuff. And in the foreword, Debi Pearl is yammering on about her husband, Michael, and she says this: "It bears my name as an author, but it is loaded with his wisdom," meaning Michael, "his creative play on words and divine biblical knowledge." So even from the very first words of this book, she's trying to downplay what happened to Mike that created her interest in this topic, his stroke. She wants to try to make it seem like Michael is a active, vital part of the ministry when it's really much more likely that he was struggling to recover from his stroke. And as I've said again and again, there is no fatigue that I've ever experienced quite like brain injury fatigue. It just takes a while. It just takes time and intentional change to recover from it. And then she moves on to a set of scriptures that I hate seeing used because they're so misused so much of the time. Lori Alexander bases her entire ministry on her misunderstanding of Titus 2. That's what she uses to base her ministry on, and the words, quote, "the aged woman likewise, that they be teachers of good things." Now, there's nothing wrong with older women teaching younger women. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm fully for that. We old crones, we have lots of knowledge, but if your idea of teaching women is to tell them never to vote, don't hold bank accounts, and all that nonsense, then you and I are going to have issues. She started off her chapter with a simple explanation of what a stroke is, but it's not exactly 100% true. That's the problem. She says you have to change your habits to change your brain. There is some scientific evidence that if you make a small change and you keep it up daily for 30 days, it can become a lifelong habit. It can be true change. And there's truth to that. Doesn't mean it's 100% true 100% of the time, but it is something helpful. Right now, I'm trying to remind myself not to drag my foot with no feeling. And that's my 30-day change that's a leftover from the stroke. So she tries to explain what neuroplasticity is, which basically what it is the malleability of your brain to change and to rewire and to do things differently. Our brains are a trip. There's all kinds of things they can do. But the thing with neuroplasticity, it's really an emerging field. It's not hard, settled science yet. So for her to make these claims are just ridiculous sometimes. And She claims it was all mapped out years and years ago, and scientists know all they need to know about the brain. Not so. She starts a chapter with a simple, yet not entirely true definition of what a stroke is. And here's her definition. Stroke, a sudden disabling attack or loss of consciousness caused by the interruption of the flow of blood to the brain, especially through thrombosis. Michael must have had a he must have had a stroke that was a blood clot in his brain. It's making it sound like that, but that's not entirely true. Let me give you the Stroke Foundation's definition. And yeah, I am working with notes today because it's been a long time since I did this in-depth review. I have to prompt myself to stay on topic, which is why this is not a live stream, because I'm too distractible. Okay, here's the Stroke Foundation's actual definition of what a stroke is. A stroke is a medical condition in which poor blood flow to the brain results in cell death. There are two main types of stroke. Ischemic, due to lack of blood flow, usually a blood clot. I'm throwing in the blood cup, that's my thing. And hemorrhagic, due to bleeding. Both result in parts of the brain not functioning properly. You know, I have had two strokes. The TIA I had and the other one were due to bleeding and my platelet disorder that runs in my family that my daughter had. Okay, so here's the thing about change and those kinds of changes. After you have a stroke, a lot of times you have to do things like go on meds for high blood pressure, for if you have blood clots like Michael Pearl is, then you have to go on a blood thinner. There's a whole thing of drugs they can put you on, cholesterol drugs, the whole 9 yards. And everything I've read on the Pearl's website and elsewhere says that Mike lost consciousness during his stroke, which means it was pretty bad. I mean, brain damage bad, recovery bad. That means lots of physical therapy, but they ran and got stem cells injected in his brain and won't do a damn thing for that. But Debbie loves woo-woo medicine like black salve and other things. So in that quiverful world I'm too familiar with, not having routine medical care is common, but resorting to crazy stuff or unproven things or experimental things is what they do. It's their jam. And so that's why they resorted to that for Michael. She seems to be completely unaware that many people have TIA, or the transient ischemic attacks, or mini strokes, without even knowing it, without even realizing it. A lot of times it is a lead up to a bigger stroke. She misses all of that in her book talking about strokes. She misses talking about the warning signs of strokes, the prevention tips, anything about how to prevent another one. But jumps right into the apocryphal story of Pedro, Paul, and George Bach-y-Rita. I'm guessing that's how you pronounce their name. And the stroke. She gets the dates of the stroke even wrong. Well, the dates of the whole Bach-y-Rita story wrong. She gets the dates. It's all about George, who is a doctor working with his father Pedro to recover from a stroke. And he's using what sounds like tough love, like forcing people to do stuff beyond their physical ability techniques. And supposedly it took Pedro from what Debbie describes as drooling vegetable status to mountain climbing in less than 6 years. The namers all thought the methods used by psychiatrist George were extremely cruel. And I have to agree with them after reading about this. So 6 years passes after that, and Pedro dies of a heart attack. The two doctors attending the autopsy decide to go look at the brain because he's had this devastating stroke 12 years before and see what the heck's going on. According to Debi Pearl, there was only 3% of alive undamaged brain stem in Pedro's brain at that autopsy. Not quite. That's not exactly. She, just like Debbie does, she misunderstands and she bobbles what actually happened. There are a lot of different versions of this story online, but not the percentage numbers and the portions were damaged, what portions were damaged. Every doctor seems to agree that Paul Bach-Irita is the father of modern neuroplasticity. And because of his father's stroke, it interested him in investigating why some folks recover function and some folks don't. There's a lot of that sort of thing going around. So she talks about that experiment and how people who are blind can see with their tongues. Yeah, see with their tongues, and other brain daring do that is at best experimental, or it is suggested. There's no hard and fast truth to anything she's saying. Blind man mountain climbing by this miraculous device of the seeing tongue and other things. And she got all of this straight off YouTube. If I know anything about YouTube, and I realize I'm on YouTube right now making a video, it's that not every single video you see about medical is right and or sourced properly. So it's extremely, extremely irresponsible to suggest otherwise. So she talks about the rewiring of the brain, and she misses all of the fascinating research about cats having strokes and getting up 10 minutes later, their brains having gone through the neuroplasticity thing and rewired right around where the stroke was. There's a lot of research going into that at this moment and how that can impact humans. She keeps talking about positive thinking versus negative thinking, rewiring your brain, and making the claim that negative thoughts merely create deeper grooves in the brain. And you'll see as the book goes on that brain grooving is one of her favorite stupid terms to throw out. Brain grooving. And she cites absolutely zero studies, no evidence of any of this. She just starts babbling it out and tells you that you should become informed and educated. And then she cites a bunch of older books that she used as her research that have now been mostly repudiated, a lot of them. And the literal pile of first links you pull up on Google when you Google neuroplasticity, when I wrote this review, the first few is where she got a lot of her info from, and I don't know how legitimate all of them are. It's just a confusing mishmash of poorly researched ideas in the stupid book. So that was chapter 1. Chapter 2 moves on to the worst, in my opinion, one of the worst chapters in the book. The story of Jill Rodrigues and her little daughter, who I'm not going to name. It's her youngest child. Jill was severely thrilled to be included in this book, and the story she told in the book, there's a lot of things wrong with it. It's very far-fetched. There's no way that a lot of this is true. I think she has done the minimal she could do for this poor child, as far as my reading of this crap. And I don't think you should be ever taking any part of your medical anything from Jill Rodrigues, a woman who lives in a RV part of the year and a barn dominium the other part of the year, with her 13 children and her husband. They don't actually work any jobs. They do their ministry just like Michael and Debbie do theirs and don't work. They do a printing ministry and they go around singing at different churches and passing the hat. So that's it. That's how they support themselves and 13 children. So why did I not like and I dreaded doing this chapter? Mostly because the Jill and David Rodrigues clan is very strange, extremely strange. Even for Quiverful, they're strange. Jill kind of borderline stalks some of the most famous Quiverful families with television shows. She once showed up at the funeral of a child that she didn't know the parents, she didn't know the children. She showed up at the funeral and took selfies with the deceased kid's parents. So she does these crazy things. She held a funeral for her sister's legs where her sister became a quadriplegic. It's just a whole lot of weird. Um, a whole lot of weird. Jill likes to blame the devil frequently for all kinds of things, from cutting her hand on a can of green beans to a number of silly things. And she endlessly posts on social media frequently. So the Rodrigues moved several times, trying to stay one step ahead of CPS, it's alleged. And Michael and Debi Pearl themselves did the same thing, moved jurisdictions, avoid CPS. And we started with the story of Jill and David's youngest daughter. Before she was born, Jill claims that she was told by the doctors that she was carrying a child that was missing her corpus callosum. In other words, there was no connection between the hemispheres of the brain. That part of the brain was just missing, according to her. The critical part of a missing corpus callosum is that it's a part of your brain that allows an information exchange, free information exchange between the two halves. It plays a vital role in things like balance, walking, and other physical functions. It's crucial. How does this happen, I hear you ask? Debi does not explain, and here's what I was able to scare up in a quick reading online. While they can't conclusively point to any one cause, I saw for possible factors there was prenatal infections or viruses like rubella, genetic abnormalities such as Anderman or Ikari syndrome, toxic metabolic conditions such as fetal alcohol syndrome. I know Jill didn't suffer from that. Something preventing the corpus callosum from growing, such as a cyst in the brain. Okay, and this is what one of the NIH-linked sites I was looking at when I was researching this book said. Corpus callosum problems can also be due to a recessive genetic disorder. In other words, you might inherit it. This means that parents can be carriers of the gene that carries the disorder, but not have the disorder themselves. So it could have been genetic. And as far as a toxic metabolic condition, Jill shills plexus. She loves her plexus, her pink drink. And according to the FDA, it is problematic because it has a methamphetamine metabolite. I don't know if that caused it, but I'm sure it didn't help. I'm not directly blaming Jill for causing the condition. I'm suggesting that her consumption of plexus willy-nilly may have played a part. So the doctor advised Jill, according to her, to have an abortion, the big A word, claiming the baby might not even survive if she, carried the child to full term and delivered. And if it did, it would be extremely mentally and physically challenged. Plus, it would be constant seizures, very likely. So Jill, being the good, quiverful wife and mother she is, opted to go ahead and have the baby, even as the baby had brain lesions, a stroke in utero, and a missing corpus callosum. So what are the long-term implications if you're missing that part of your brain? Here's what I got from one of the NIH-linked sites, the National Institute of Health. While its presence is not essential for survival, those who have problems with the corpus callosum will often fall behind their peers in development. Children with agenesis may be blind, deaf, or never learn to walk or talk, while others can be very high functioning. A disorder of the corpus callosum is not a disease or an illness at fault in itself. Many people with agenesis of corpus callosum lead healthy, productive lives. However, it can lead to medical problems, such as seizures, which require medical intervention. Well, we know one thing about quiverful people and non-noms. Women do not get the same level of medical care, nor do children that the men do. And they're told that to go to the doctors all the time is a type of idolatry, even if you have the kind of chronic health condition that warrants that. Well, it's not a death sentence that Debbie and Jill were trying to say it was. It's a disability for many on a very sliding scale. Debbie likes to follow this dramatic story by babbling out about baby brains rewiring and making new connections much more easily. And then she repeats the lie that Pedro Bach-y-Rita only had 3% of his brainstem. As a lady used to write for me at NLQ, named Mel from When Cows and Kids Collide, who's a science teacher, kindly pointed out, the part of the brain that was damaged in Pedro Bach-y-Rita was not the brainstem. 3% of a brainstem death is completely incompatible with life. It was actually 97% of the nerves that connect the cerebral cortex to the spinal column that were dead, not the brainstem, as Debbie claims. Debbie claims that Jill made her baby almost entirely normal by praying over her, playing music around her, holding her, and a pile of other normal mothering things. She spoke of her 12 brothers and sisters being the best therapy sessions ever, ignoring the fact that there are available real legitimate scientific-backed physical therapy, occupational therapy for kids with Genesis issue. A child being born into a very poor, quiverful household has as much a chance of receiving decent or appropriate medical care as like nomad farmers on the steppes of Outer Mongolia. It just does not happen, which should be criminal in the U.S. If you withhold any medical care from your child, I think that should be something that should be punishable by the law, but that's just me. Physical therapy makes a real difference in recovery, so does occupational therapy, and it will help the child to develop more normally and assess the problems. So that's something that I'm very, very down on. I mean, supportive of is PT and OT. I went through about 6 months of PT, OT, almost 10 years ago involving my asthma, Johns Hopkins. I went 3 times a week for months, and it worked. It worked. I don't have the same kind of asthma I did, and so it's a good thing. Now I can breathe through an attack, and I don't end up in the ICU or the ER any longer. Jill's update in the book on her child. Quote, to this day, I'm going to call her Jay. Jay has shown no signs of being behind developmentally. She tries to talk, walk, and is right on top of her age. The doctors scratch their heads, eager, it seems, to find something in which she is lacking behind her slow. They find nothing. So these words I'm emphasizing are all capitals because that's how Jill writes. Jill, in her colorful, dramatic way of writing, has always made me just laugh so hard. She didn't use her favorite word, severe, anywhere in the piece. I was really shocked because that's one of her favorites. But there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind when reading or hearing about this story. All the recent photos that she shares of this child is a child unable to walk or stand without support very long. not necessarily a kid hitting all their developmental milestones. It's wishful thinking at best. And at 18 months, Janessa was, and I did it, Jay was not actually walking yet. Now, scientists don't understand why some kids live with this condition and do well and some don't. They, and kids with significant developmental delays may actually hit all their milestones like a normal kid in the first year or two of life, but it's not indicative of no problems. What it is indicative of is the quiverful tendency to claim miraculous things that aren't true while ignoring all established science and medicine. And then we move on, chapter 3, to baby brains, where Jill starts making, not Jill, Debbie starts making all kinds of claims. She starts off by mentioning Pedro's brain damage yet again, talking about how because of this we can train our babies to excel like never before. Her words, not mine. She talks about imparting self-control, which is funny considering that everything Michael and Debi Pearl have said about training self-control in a child involves beating somebody with a plumbing line. She babbles on and on about the stars, the 10 trillion connections in the brain following these connections that are like stars by saying this, quote, "Science has proven that your child's emotional strength and mental well-being are not inherited, but are a product of what we introduce into their world." So did you hear that? That's a justification that the Pearls and others in these non-denominational groups use to isolate their children. But she doesn't understand there's ample proof of some mental conditions being inherited, not being lack of positive thinking or lack of being protected. Some types of bipolar and some types of tendency towards depression, it's been well established by science. Some of that is just inherited. It's the luck of the draw. I've also seen studies and evidence speaking to the issues of inherited trauma going down many generations. Now, this is a new and emerging field of scientific inquiry that puts her words to a lie, the chronic generational traumas that come down. Debbie says this in her book: every person in their life, every babysitter, every playmate, everything they see, hear, and feel is contributing to their eventual emotional and mental framework, unquote. And just like that, we're back in the standard Pearl brand of isolating your children from everyone else and everything else. We've seen how not so well that has worked out with the substandard lives of their own offspring. None of them are doctors, lawyers, or anything like that. They're all pretty much scraping by. Debbie follows this up by talking about how our learning starts in the womb. And I'm not going to argue with her about that. She says this is why you should read aloud and sing to your bump. Again, I can't argue with that. She goes further to state this is how babies learn to bond with their mother by their voice. All true, but Debbie never mentions the dark flip side of this that science has come up with. Trauma, angry voices, and abuse of the mother while pregnant have been proven to result in babies without growth in some areas of their brain. It sets them at a disadvantage before they're even born. Then Debbie explains brain terms in her own simple and not so correct way. Neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters. She gets right, sort of right. And then we go here, right into the sloppy 7 of the cheap and nasty explanations of neurotransmitters. Oh, Debbie. A Debbie quote: dopamine is often called the happy chemical. Actually, not quite. The role of dopamine is far more complex than that. It's more complex than any amount of chemical happiness she's claiming. Not only does it provide those pleasant feelings, it also plays a role in movement, learning, and emotional responses. It may be a player in addiction as well and is linked with a number of illnesses. Another Debbie. Serotonin makes you feel important. Utter casual. I just have to throw that out. It's awful. What serotonin does is it regulates our moods. That's exactly how it works. And it works in conjunction with the dopamine that she was talking about earlier. It is responsible for communication with the nervous system cells, and for the proper functions of sleeping, eating, maintaining bone health, and digestion. Too much or too little serotonin can wreak havoc with your body and your emotions. Okay, there goes Debbie with another one. Cortisol is known as the stress hormone. That's way too simplistic and too broad of a definition. What cortisol actually is a steroid hormone that gets manufactured in your adrenal gland. What it does is this, and I'm quoting from one of the medical websites: because most bodily cells have cortisol receptors, it affects many different functions in the body. Cortisol can help control blood sugar levels, regulate metabolism, help reduce inflammation, and assist with memory formations. It has a controlling effect on salt and water balance and helps control blood pressure. In women, cortisol also supports developing fetuses during pregnancy. All of these functions make cortisol a critical hormone. There are ailments as well caused by too low or too high a level of cortisol. I've seen a lot of misinformation pushed by the dieting industry about cortisol and how it affects weight loss and stress and various things. And while it does play a small role, it's not what they're trying to say either. That's why Debbie's assumption of it is just meaningless as can be. Noradrenaline is the fight and flight chemical and works with adrenaline. Well, it's not just fight or flight. It's responsible for your body's response to exercise, your ability to concentrate, and your mood. It mobilizes your body for action is what it does. Endorphin is the love hormone. Again, simplistic and not quite the whole story. Endorphins can occur when you do pleasurable things like exercise, eat something you really like chocolate, have crazy bedroom antics with your significant other. Sometimes your body will release endorphins when you're injured. I've had that happen before. And when narcotics bind to the receptors of endorphins when you've been injured and you're taking oxycodone or whatever. It's one of the most complex, and they don't quite understand everything that it does in the endocrine system out there. They just don't know. Again, it's another one that they're doing research on. Debbie again. Oxytocin is known as the bonding hormone. Oh my goodness. Oxytocin is related to motherhood, and that it drives uterine contractions and assists in lactation too if you're going to breastfeed. It's known as a love or cuddle hormone because if you're cuddling your little baby or breastfeeding it, it gets released in scads. And even something like playing with your dog releases it. What Debbie misses is that it also can have a dark side. It's not all cuddling and playing with the dog. Oxytocin, I'm quoting this from another medical site, can also intensify memories of bonding gone bad, such as in cases where men have poor relationships with their mothers. It can also make people less accepting of people they see as outsiders. In other words, Whether oxytocin makes you feel cuddly or suspicious of others depends on the environment, and it depends upon what you've been through. So Debbie is all sunshine and roses with this crap and wrong ideas. Literally everything is much more complex than anything she's ever stated in this book or is going to go on to state. Melatonin is the hormone that helps you sleep. Well, for a change, she's actually right here. Melatonin is a hormone that tells your body when to sleep. She does not mention that it can be screwed up with light exposure, devices, the light from the devices, and any number of things. And you could literally buy bottles of the stuff to help you sleep when you're having insomnia. You could also do things to hack it, like get blue blocker glasses that will protect you from the light of your devices to allow you to have a more normal circadian rhythm and to actually sleep. Another quote from the book. Our feelings decide which neurotransmitter will be released. Again, not how this works. This is not how any of this works. Your body releases or does not release neurotransmitters because of signals in your body, not merely because of your emotions. It's just that simple. You exercise hard and your body responds by releasing dopamine, noradrenaline, endorphins, and cortisol. No emotions required. This is just another way to shame people for having feelings and emotions that don't line up like Debbie believes they should. So then she goes on and starts talking in chapter 4 about babies and their neural pathways and the better brains. And I don't see how she can actually say this based on all the literature they put out about beating children, or as they call it, discipline. This chapter, though, was very standard boilerplate. Ideas that everybody just has about babies that no one can really disagree with, until we get to ultrasounds. She talks about that. Bear with me. I'm trying to push through this just awful book. And I said 4, and I don't know if I'm actually on 4 or more over 3. So some of the things she pushes at the end of the chapter are touch your baby because this is important for brain health. I think it's unbelievably sad that she has to spell this out for her followers, that they should be touching their baby in a loving way, touching the baby. Because I would assume every mother in this world, well, most of them would touch their baby frequently. She says skin-to-skin contact is beneficial. Not going to argue with that. Kangaroo care is the best. Those are her 3. Which is redundant because she just talked about skin-to-skin being the best. Kangaroo care and skin-to-skin are very similar and have similar benefits. I used to carry my son around in a front pack all the time, so I get what she's saying there. And she uses her justification of what will happen if you don't touch your child by bringing up the Romanian orphanages of the 1980s and the 1990s. Okay, it's true. The Romanian orphanages were incredibly awful, and the kids were definitely neglected. My daughter went on one of her mission trips to Romania and got to see firsthand what some of those kids were like in the orphanages that were her own age. And she told me, she said, Mom, they have no souls. I wouldn't say that, but I would say they're probably lacking because of what went down then. These kids are having profound difficulties in life after they've gotten out of these awful warehouse orphanages. The lack of touching, though, wasn't from the lack of love or anything more than neglect. It was not an experiment like she tried to claim. She tried to say it was an experiment run by the communist government of Romania. It was because of the sheer overwhelming numbers of children in these places. So many children were abandoned by their parents to these orphanages because the parents could not feed the children. They literally could not feed them. It was extreme poverty that drove this. not the fact that they didn't love their children. Giving your child up to an agency that will care for it when you cannot afford to feed them might be one of the more loving things you can try to do. But you also have to keep in mind that Romania at that time banned abortion and any form of birth control. It was forced birth there, like they really want to force on us here. When you have an extremely low caregiver to child ratio, substandard care happens. It just does. And study after study has proven that. And that was the situation in Romania, not the communist government running some experiment. In places like Zambia, it's even worse, and the child to caregiver ratio approaches 70 children per caregiver. This is the human cost of bad government policy, right there, and the children are paying the price. Even as late as 2006, when Romania was free, they were struggling with what to do with the orphans in the country because it's a desperately poor place, and it wasn't equipped for freedom at that time. It was rather ill-equipped to be free. And I've read several books on the topic. One of them I read was by an orphan from Romania called God's Buried Children. It's by Daniel Farkas. He was a child of those orphanages that ended up living under the street and with a bunch of other orphans. And a lot of things went wrong that were just crazy. Then Debbie moves on to one of her bigger hatreds, screens. Computer screens, laptop screens, tablet screens. What's my husband doing? Phone screens. Okay? She says this: a baby's brain does not interpret the flashing screens of digital media. Okay, I just have to ask this. Who are all these people propping their babies up in front of screens? Computer screens, tablets, and television? I don't see this happening at that age. Most people do not expose their children to screens at all before toddlerhood, when you're so desperate to go poop in private that you might let your toddler watch Frozen for the 10th millionth time so you can get a moment of personal alone time you desperately need to go to the bathroom. I'm not going to shame any parent for that, because those things happen. Debbie tries to claim that this non-existent problem ruins kids' vision for all time and eternity. I thought it was self-love that made you go blind that these people preach, but apparently it was screens too. And then we come to the massage therapy portion of the book. And there's just literally one quick throwaway line about massage. It has zero to do with brain development. I'm not even sure why it's in there. Debbie moves on to hearing and starts fear-mongering hard over you messing up your child's hearing, you selfish woman, by getting, hold on, wait for it, ultrasounds. Gasp! Horror! Debbie goes on to claim having ultrasounds causes brain damage and hearing loss. Too bad this has already been soundly, scientifically debunked years ago by real scientists that studied this. While it's never a good idea to have excessive testing for anything, the usual ultrasounds you get in pregnancy aren't going to harm your child, your baby. And then we move to language, where Debbie orders you to simply talk to your child. Again, a no-brainer that literally everyone does already. Sweet avocado on toast. This woman gives you all these orders to do this very standard stuff that we all do, and spends pages and pages and pages and pages on it. Shoshana, her daughter, chimes in for pages and pages to tell you to talk to your child. These people are the worst. Debbie talks about children's sleep or lack thereof, and gives a very standard advice about sleep routines and why they need sleep. Then tells you if your baby wakes up crying, you're doing something wrong. She then repeats her simple misunderstanding of oxytocin. Also keep in mind that Debbie and Michael believe that a child that keeps waking in the night and keeps getting out of bed and the like should be beaten. And I wish I was joking about that, but there's a section in Michael's book about that. Then she talks about laughter. Laughter is good for your brain, Debbie says. Good for your brain, without explaining that it's not cruel laughter at the expense of anyone else. Just like her and Michael probably do. She shows shade so many times. I remember her laughing over what she called somebody was hillbilly ugly one time and thinking that was one of the meanest things I've ever heard a Christian call somebody. Hillbilly ugly. That's just a few short paragraphs. That infuriates me because laughter is good for any number of things. It's good for actually even pain reduction, and I'm a big believer in it. But then we get to the truly weirdest part of the chapter. Quote, rough and tumble. Debbie spends another pile of pages talking about the importance of daddy roughhousing with his kids for bonding purposes. Maybe. But we've all seen the inherent casual cruelty as practiced by Michael Pearl. Likely or not, how Michael does it is not good for the development of any child's brain. That would be my assumption, just some of the stories that I've seen on their website. There is some scientific evidence that this is true, but the type of play needs to be between children and be managed. Not free-for-all bullying. Makes me think of the fact that when my cat wants to play, he runs up to me and bites me on the hand very lightly. He likes to play rough. He likes to roughhouse. And he knows that I will roughhouse with him, so he always comes to me. And we play. And there's nobody abusing anybody, not me abusing him, not him abusing me. So clearly, rough play may have its place, but not with Michael Pearl ever in my eyes. It's just too easy to imagine it spinning into abuse and for Michael to pull out a plumbing line. Debbie does approve of one medical test you can have for your baby. The SPECT scan, SPECT. Debbie explains it in two simple terms like she always does, failing to touch on the fact that the tests use radioactive dyes and an MRI-like machinery. And this is not a test that's routinely run on children. It's rare to give a kid this scan. It's almost always exclusively used for brain issues like stroke, looking for bone fractures, and brain-related type injuries. Rarely for other conditions. So I guess if you want to drop your baby on the head and you say, I may have done brain damage, they might get a scan. But this is not a normal thing. And that brain scan thing is just a weird little paragraph that she tucks between two long bits about the benefits of roughhousing. Debbie hops around this book from one thing to another like a hyperactive toad with ADD hopped up on meth. I mean, she just jumps around. So I laugh that she prefers the SPECT scan to the ultrasound. Ultrasounds are just harmless sound waves going through your body versus a test with an injection of radioactive substance that you might actually well be allergic to while being scanned by a giant magnetized thing. I don't know which one sounds safer to you, but I know I have my ideas on that. And then she says this hideous thing about children, sensitive children. To remain overtly sensitive is a selfish choice. Up yours, Debbie. Some people are just sensitive, some are not. And there you go. Next, I'm going to break off here because I think I'm like 4 or 5 chapters in. Her next chapter, she makes a bunch of claims about music that have already been debunked. And I don't remember exactly what kind of music, but I have a feeling it's all hymns and classical music. And she's going to claim if you play rock and roll or rap, you're going to rot your child's brain, even if it has a Christian theme. So here you go. This is the first 4 or 5 chapters of her book, Create a Better Brain Using Neuroplasticity. Okay, so we're done with that. So I have to talk about a couple of housekeeping things really quickly. Please stop PMing me about Without a Box of Kleenex being shown on Fox News. I don't care. I literally do not care. I don't care what happens to her. I don't care what she does. I don't care. There are many of my friends who are on YouTube that already do great commentary about her and the things she does. Watch them, please, because I'm not going to speak on this at all. The other thing is we got somewhat good news the other day with my husband's medical exam and his tests at the hospital. He has an infection in his prostate, a massive infection. His prostate is 3 times the size it's supposed to be. He's being put on all kinds of medication. They're going to try to manage this thing with medication. They did an ultrasound and think he likely doesn't have cancer, but they won't know for sure until a couple of months when this swelling has gone down and he's better. So they're just going to repeat everything, but I'm feeling like released. Okay, you guys, this has been almost an hour. I knew this was going to be a lengthy process because I kind of have to go through this line by line almost and pull up my review I wrote in NLQ and go over it because it's been a while since I read that book. I'm going to try to get my hands on Pigs in the Parlor for the next review and look at those things. And we're going to continue this review series every single Saturday. You'll be getting this. And I'm about to restart the Righteous Gemstones ones and figure out when I want to do that. So stay tuned. Big changes, lots of fun. We're doing this. We're doing this. Get in. Love you guys. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful weekend.